how am I actually losing fat via respiration? What the hell does that even mean? How is something that occupied this physical space on the side of me leaving my body through my mouth? And there's a very clear answer there, right? Which I'm sure you're queued up to. When you take a breath in, you're generally breathing in oxygen, O2. There's some other things, but we'll just stick to oxygen. When you exhale, you're breathing out CO2. The difference between those two is that carbon molecule. Well, one of the things that's important to understand here is all of your carbohydrates, which is that word itself is a carbon that has been hydrated. So it is a carbon molecule attached to a water molecule. It is a simple chain of carbons. Your fat molecules are also chains of carbon. All of metabolism really, in terms of energy production, is simply trying to figure out a way to break those carbon bonds. As a result, we get energy from that. We use that energy to create a molecule called ATP, which is the central source of energy for any living being, right? That carbon is then floating around in free form, which is bad news internally. So we've got to figure out a way to get that carbon out of our system. So all of energy production, all of fatigue management really comes down to this core issue of how are we handling carbon and how are we moving it around the body? And so what we do is we do this sneaky thing. So another question I like to ask people is, why do we breathe?
Well, for two reasons. To bring oxygen into the system and to offload carbon dioxide. But the neural trigger for breathing is when carbon dioxide hits a threshold level in the set of neurons in the brainstem and elsewhere, activate the phrenic nerve or the gasp reflex or a combination of things, and we inhale or inhale.
Right. So a reduction of oxygen intake generally doesn't stimulate ventilation unless you're at altitude. Then that sort of changes, right? In general, it's an elevation in CO2 that's going to stimulate breathing off. The only reason you bring in O2 for the most part is to get rid of the CO2. Oxygen is not a fuel source. It is not a way, and it works the same with fire, by the way. So you know you have to have oxygen present for a fire to go, and if you squelch oxygen, the fire will go out, right? That's sort of half of how those like fire extinguishers work. But we think then that means oxygen is the fuel. It is not the fuel. It is something entirely different. It is a necessary product that is necessary for the metabolism process to actually occur. All right, so we're kind of dancing around an idea here, which is this carbon cycle of life. So what happens in plants is they generally will breathe in the opposite and breathe out the opposite of humans. So a plant will breathe in CO2 and exhale O2. All right, this is why we have to have a certain amount of these things in algae and forests and trees and stuff to maintain this O2, CO2 balance in our atmosphere. We do the opposite. And so we have this wonderful circle of life. We breathe in O2, breathe out CO2. They do the opposite. Well, what happens is because carbohydrates are long chains of carbon and fats are as well. Generally, when we think about fats, by the way, it's important to understand that structure a little bit. So if we think about triglycerides, it is a 3-carbon backbone chain of glycerol. So it's 1, 2, 3. And horizontally running off of each one of those are fatty acid chains, right? And so we form this structure that looks like an E, right? Like the letter E, 3 in the back, and then 3 chains coming off of it. Each of those chains are called fatty acids, and each of those fatty acids are a length of carbon, right? Or a number of carbons strung together. However many carbons are there determines which type of fatty acid it is, right? So stearic acid, linoleic acid, like any different number of things. It's also what determines whether or not it is a monounsaturated or polyunsaturated, as if carbon requires a special thing called a double bond. So if there's a double bond across every carbon and carbon, then they're all fully saturated and you're great. If there's any of them that are not double bonded, in fact, an example, if there is one that doesn't have a double bond, that is now called monounsaturated. And if there are many, it is called polyunsaturated. So there's pros and cons to all of these things, right? In either case, we're still talking long carbon chains. So what a plant will do is bring in carbon. And then it has this wonderful ability to use energy from the sun called photosynthesis. And it can take those carbons that it inhales and use the energy from the sun to form a bond. Now, in our prior discussion when we were going over hypertrophy, we talked about the energy that was required to go through protein synthesis. That's because forming a new atom or a new bond between atoms oftentimes takes energy. In these cases, it does. The same thing happens here. So if a plant does not have oxygen or does not have carbon dioxide in the air, it has no fuel. Basically, think about it as that's what it eats. It needs to get nitrogen from the ground and the soil, just like we need to get nitrogen from our protein. But fuel-wise, it needs to get carbon dioxide. Then it needs sun to give it energy so that it can actually form that bond, right? That's what it's getting its fuel from. All right. So if we think about a classic plant that produces either a starch or a fruit, here's what happens. It inhales that carbon and then it starts packing it away. Now, in a root vegetable, what it does is it stores those things together. And if we store that thing and we grow a fruit at the bottom of it, we tend to call those things starches. All right? It's going to then take the carbon that is packed away in its root and send it up the tree. And it's going to actually do that by breaking it down into a smaller form of carbohydrate that we tend to often call things like sucrose and glucose. It'll ship that up the tree, it'll go out to the leaves, and it'll convert it into the fruit. And it's going to eventually transform that stuff into smaller carbon things called fructose. And if we think about the fruit or the sugar in fruit, it's often in the form of fructose or sucrose or a combination, and sometimes glucose. So we have these smaller 6-carbon chains, generally in the form of glucose, that are being made from this larger storage of carbohydrates that we call starch, right? So it's packed in together. Your body does the exact same thing. So if it's a potato and it has a whole bunch of glucose packed away, we call it starch. If it's in your quadricep and we pack about a whole bunch of glucose away, we now call it glycogen. If it's in your blood as that 6-carbon chain, we call it glucose. If it's in the tree and in the fruit, we call it fructose. Right? Those are different molecules, but that's effectively the same thing happens. So the biology or the chemistry is almost identical. It just runs in the reverse order. And that's why, again, tubers and potatoes and stuff tend to be starches, and fruits tend to be glucose, fructose, and sucrose. So we have this wonderful circle of life. The plants can survive on just breathing in the CO2 and then getting the energy from the sun. We don't have that ability, at least to my knowledge, to run through photosynthesis. So the only way we can get carbon into our system is to actually ingest carbon, which means we have to eat the starch, the fruit, the animal, some other form of stored carbon to get that into our system. We then pack that away. We put the carbohydrates, as you mentioned earlier, either in our liver, our blood, or in our muscles. We put the fat generally in adipose tissue. We'll put a little bit in muscle cells as intramuscular triglycerides, and then the protein we'll use as structure, right, to do different things. We don't like to use protein as material or fuel. It's better used as structure. And what we have to do then is, if all of a sudden we realize that storage is getting too much in our body, in other words, we're gaining too much weight, we have to figure out how to get the carbons out of our body. And that is metabolism, right? Anytime we're trying to break a carbon bond so that we can get energy to make ATP, that's going to release the carbon out of our tissue into the blood. We have to bring in oxygen to bind that carbon molecule to make CO2 so we can exhale it and put it back into the atmosphere.
It's a beautiful description of the circle of life and energy utilization in the human body.